and welcome to a literacy piece in our Now What Summit. We're going to look at the science of reading comprehension and thinking classrooms with Dr. Erin McNeil. And Erin, I am very excited about your presentation geared toward third grade through 12th grade educators. So I love the thinking classroom strategies, and as a former literacy teacher, I'm excited to hear where this goes.
Great.
All right, take it away.
Okay, so if you see on the bottom of the screen here, there's a link to my presentation as well as a QR code. You may want that. There's some graphic organizers and some resources that may be helpful later when you're thinking about using thinking classrooms in your own literacy spaces. So today we're going to talk about reading comprehension, the science of reading comprehension. So there are 3 parts to comprehension. First, we need to be able to decode. So that is where phonemic awareness and phonics, that's where they all come in. And next, we need to be able to make connections. So that is background knowledge. And then last, we have to think deeply about what students have read or what we have read. So we are going to focus on number 2 and 3 today, how to make connections and how to think deeply. So the first thing we have to do is we have to build background knowledge. And this is for everything we read. If we read a short story or an article, we should talk about background knowledge. It should not just be over a big novel study or a big unit. We should always start with background knowledge. And you can do that in several ways. Here are some different ways. Vocabulary. Dr. Freddie Hebert has great resources on her website, textproject.org, that help you to pick vocabulary words where you are painting a picture of the theme or events in a text. So when students look at vocabulary words, they have an idea of what's going to happen in the text. And it isn't just random words that you've chosen because they're long or because that's what was already there in the text. So we're using words that paint a picture of what's going to happen in our text. We can ask questions, what we need to know, how well do we know it, and discuss those together. And there can also be some type of engagement where you're activating curiosity and interest in the background knowledge. So we also need to make connections. So we know from Geneva Gay's research that students learn best when they connect to required curriculum through their prior experiences. So if they can connect something that they have done or something that they already know to scenes in a text, they can make a stronger connection. So if you consider what you're reading and what connections students could make, these are some questions that I ask myself about culture or community, because many students have previous experience with these things. So if we think about traditions or celebrations, cultural or religious traditions or celebrations that may be in the text that students could connect to. When we think about scenes where a community gathers, you can think about places where students have maybe been in community gatherings, how students could relate to characters. So what's happening in the characters' lives that may have also happened with students. And also text to self, text to world, or text to text. So after we have built that background knowledge, and before we start reading a text, we need to tell students what we're going to do after we read the text. What is the purpose? Again, I want to stress before we read the text, right? Not at the end, but before we start a text. Because an authentic way of looking at how comprehension takes place is our purpose. For example, when I read the book, Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading, I read it in order to create a presentation. So I was thinking about my purpose of the reading as I read the text. I knew what I was going to do with what I read. So some issues in comprehension instruction is drill and kill strategies. So focusing on just strategies, questions, not having students apply what they read, not asking them to solve problems, and not giving them an end goal. One of the best ways to get students to comprehend is through project-based learning, when students have a purpose. And often we are asking students comprehension questions that from our head or from someone else's head, right? The ability to answer someone else's questions. We need students to generate their own purpose and their own questions. So effective comprehension, we build background knowledge first. That's number one. And then here are some things we could do for a purpose. We could transform a story into a new form, such as a play or a poem or a different modality than what we've already used. We could have some kind of authentic discussion. We could have students make predictions. We could use some type of writing, and we could also use visualization. So connecting that to building thinking classrooms. So we're going to think about the first 3 moves from Dr. Liljedahl. And he talks about move number 1. There are 3 types of tasks we can use in a thinking classroom. Non-curricular tasks and scripted curricular tasks are the ones that we'll talk about today. So if we think about, we could use the first 5 minutes with a thinking task. I'm going to give you an example of that in just a minute. Or we could also do scripted curricular task. Notice that he says we begin by asking a question about prior knowledge or background knowledge, and then we extend that background knowledge. So this is the same in literacy. We need to think about prior knowledge, and we need to make those connections. So connection 1. Scripted or non-curricular task could be the purpose of the reading material that students are given, and we also build on the background knowledge we've already activated. So move number 2 is to form collaborative groups by having students in visibly random groups. So we can form visibly random groups and groups of 3 to think about literacy. So if we think about move number 2, historically, literacy researchers have argued that literacy is a social activity, that we learn more about what we've read if we talk with others about it. So using these visibly random groups is very important to literacy instruction as well. And move number 3, where students are sitting, when they're sitting, they're anonymous. When they're up and they're working together, they are more likely to engage. So we can use vertical non-permanent surfaces. We can also have 1 marker per group and move the marker around the group. And this gets students thinking. So here's an example of a non-curricular task. We could have students read this poem. So when they come in, this would probably take 10 to 15 minutes. Ask students to read the poem and decide which is more destructive, fire or ice. I would ask them to read it twice and then to jot down any notes or thoughts they have about which would be more destructive, fire or ice. The next, I would put them in visibly random groups. I would usually do this using cards. So playing cards where, when I get a group of 3 that have the same card, they would be in a group. And then I would ask them to move to a visibly random surface in their groups of 3. They would have 1 marker per group. The person that was writing could not write their own ideas. They have to write their group members' ideas. And each person has to take a turn with the marker. Once they were in those groups, then, and only then, I would give them the side that they are arguing. So they have all these thoughts. They've thought about all these thoughts. When they're in their group, I would give them fire or ice. And so then after they've thought about both sides, they would get to argue this. I would give them about 10 minutes to discuss this and to write down their ideas on their non-permanent surface. And then I would ask them to present their argument. And then I would ask them, how did you engage differently than if you had just read and discussed the poem? So when you were arguing a side or debating a side and you knew what you were going to do, how was this different? So that is a non-curricular task. We could also do scripted curricular task and create our own tasks in literacy. So here's a graphic organizer that you could use to create a task. So the first thing we would do here is we would look at the central text. What is the central text? So that is the middle. Because I'm a literacy person, I also always find other texts. So if there are other texts that can be helpful, I would add those in there. And notice the pink Post-it there, the question about prior knowledge and a question that extends prior knowledge. So those are very important, right? We're starting with those before we even read the text. And then next, I would look at the final task. So I would start here in the corner. What is the final task? And then it could be one of these: solving a real world problem, meeting a design challenge, an abstract question, an investigation, or a position on an issue. I would think about what background information students needed to know. And then I would think about how I could ensure that students had enough resources and knew the purpose of how they were going to complete this task. Okay, so here's an example that I created. So the central text would be Matt de la Peña's Last Stop on Market Street. My question about prior knowledge: how do you feel when others help you when you are struggling? And then a question that extends prior knowledge: what can we do in our communities to help others? And do you know of anything people do in your community that helps others? So this could be like a church community or a food bank or maybe Goodwill, somewhere where people are helping others. Okay, and the final task. So I did 2 final tasks here because we could do elementary or we could do secondary. So if it was elementary, I would ask them to create a poster that describes ways that we help others in our community. If it was secondary, I would ask them to conduct research, then create a video that provides an overview of the services offered to homeless citizens in Indianapolis. So if you are unfamiliar with the text, Last Stop on Market Street, the main character and his grandmother go to a food bank and serve Sunday lunches every Sunday. And he grumbles about going, and then he finally realizes the reason for going. The YouTube video is linked here, so you could listen to the whole book if you are interested. So that's where I'm getting my final task, if I'm thinking about ways to help others and the main themes in this text. So when I'm thinking about this: solving a real world problem, meeting a design challenge, exploring an abstract question, conducting an investigation, or taking a position on an issue, these tasks come from project-based learning, which we know from the research that the best way for reading comprehension is to use project-based learning. So the elementary kids creating a poster would be a design challenge where they're creating a poster that shows that. And the high school kids would also be doing a design challenge where they're creating a video of things that could happen, that could help others in Indianapolis. I added some other text I may use that would be helpful in completing the final project. My final project lends itself to students having to do a little bit of research on their own, but these texts could help students think about local resources or about ways that people care and help others as they're thinking about their final task. Background information students may need to know. They may need some poster examples or a list of services available in our community. I feel like anytime I've used project-based learning, I've come in with lots of background information and I've still had to find extra resources for background information. So just be prepared that students may need some scaffolding as you're thinking about ways to create their final project and thinking about resources that they may need. Okay, and so once you have your background knowledge completed and your final product completed, now we think about, how do we incorporate thinking classrooms? How will we use visibly random groups? Where can students use vertical non-permanent surfaces? And is there a 5-minute thinking task to start? So when I'm thinking about my own project here, a 5-minute thinking task to start, I would ask students the questions that I created for background knowledge. How do we help others in our community? What do we know? What services are offered? Do we know people that work on those services? So I would start with a question about that. Opportunities for visibly random groups. I would use visibly random groups for my final project. So I would tell students what we were going to do for the final project. Then we would read the text after our discussion of background knowledge. And then I would put them in visibly random groups to create their final product. I would ask them to brainstorm their final project on a vertical non-permanent surface. And this extra, what concerns do you have? This is just for you to kind of think about, what might students need to know that we what might come up, what idea, what resources maybe we should have handy, or what resources in our classroom, those kind of things. If you would like to learn more about this, we are having a Thinking Classrooms Cadre in Literacy, and it starts July 19th. So there's still some time to sign up and to work through this with me and to think about the ways that we can use more than just the 3 moves in the Thinking Classrooms Cadre. And thank you very much. We appreciate your time and hope that you've gotten some ideas for how to use Thinking Classrooms in Literacy.